morning for some of you and midday for others, is to tell you a little bit about how science and research can be a very transposable skill set that allows you to move around the world. And George alluded to some of that. The other thing I want to do, because my career has spanned several decades for a variety of positions as a student, as a postdoc, as a faculty member, and as a senior leader in academic institutions. I also do want to point out how important mentors are, how important students are, collaborators, and in fact, interdisciplinarity in research. So let's see. And my slides don't want to advance. Let's see what I gotta do here. Stop screen sharing for a moment. Let's see if this works now. That's not good. My apologies for the usual technical issues. Oh. We may have to do this the old-fashioned way. Okay, so as George mentioned, I'm German, as my last name says, but I was born in Italy, and I'm not going to tell you how all the nationalities came together. But I've lived in 7 countries and on 4 continents, and so one of the things that tells you is that you can do science in a variety of settings. But the other really nice thing about it is that you wind up learning about other cultures and dealing with people in a variety of settings. So as an undergrad, I studied biology and philosophy in Germany and finished up in Switzerland with a degree in biochemistry. I was fortunate to do my PhD with a Nobel laureate at Stanford. And since he's dead now, died earlier this year, I can tell you a few things about it, how we came together. When I was looking for a lab for my PhD, he had 1 graduate student, 1 PhD student. And so I asked him what it was like to work for Paul, and his answer was very clear. Don't do it. He is in ... And so I considered that advice. That student finished a year after I started, and 2 of us started together. The other person should have listened. I got along with Paul great. Now, as George also mentioned, I did a postdoc in the US at Baylor. And then I started my independent academic career. I spent 23 years in the US, and for reasons that's, if you want, we can talk about it, had nothing to do with science. It had something to do with politics at the time. I left and fell on my feet and got a job in Australia with an endowed chair. So this is sort of a map of the places I lived in. So there are 3 places I lived in Europe. I lived in a variety of places in the US. I lived in 2 places in South America, and I lived and worked in 3 places in Australia. And so it does tell you a little bit about how you can move around the world doing science and learning about different cultures and also helping other cultures. So as a scientist, we all know how important external funding is, grant funding. And so my CV lists about 50 grants and some 200 publications. I've done all of the academic stuff. So I started out as an assistant professor and was promoted to an associate professor with tenure in the US. as I mentioned, I moved to Sydney in Australia and got an endowed chair, which, at the time, I will tell you, Paul Berg asked me, why the hell did you give that up? Because an endowed chair means you have some real money. But I decided I wanted to do something for a system that had been very good to me. And so I became a head of school, which is equivalent to a dean and associate dean research for the faculty at JCU in Australia. And as George mentioned, I also was the Vice Chancellor Research and Innovation at YachayTech in Ecuador, which in Europe would be a vice rector or a prorector, in the US, a vice president, and Australia, DVC. Doing the usual stuff that people still do. I'm a member of a bunch of editorial boards, and I review grants for a variety of organizations, currently in Australia and in Hong Kong. But I also still occasionally get asked to do it in Ecuador. And I do some work, so I sit on the steering committee of the G2MC, and that's why I was kindly invited to give this talk, but also chair the HUGO Human Genome Organization Forum, and I sit on some other committees. So let's start talking a little bit about career planning. You want to start early, you want to think about it regularly and revisit it regularly to make sure that you're doing and going where you want to go. For those of us who are in academia, there are really three pillars: research, teaching, and service and engagement. And they're technically all considered to be equal, but at most institutions, some are more equal than others. And I think you need to know what that is. If you want to have an international career, this is probably the one you want to pay the most attention to, that is research. And you want to be, within reason, active in social media so that people know what you're doing. You clearly also don't want to be driven crazy about what goes on social media. I think work-life balance is an important thing to consider as you navigate your career. Future prospects, whether they're at the institution you're currently at or whether you might want to move. Alternatives to academia. I've had probably 30 or 40 graduate students in my lab, and of the really good ones, none of them wound up in academia for any length of time. All of them tried their hands at academia, and they wound up in industry in one way or another. One is now an associate director of research for one of the pharma companies. So, it's interesting to see how people go. And the other thing that's probably on very few people's mind, and I know for me it wasn't very much, was that you need to think about retirement, how to fund retirement. So if your government runs a national retirement program, you don't have much choice. But in countries like the US and Australia, you also have some private retirement funds in addition to Social Security, or in Australia, it's called the age pension. And so in the US, one will be TIA-CREF. Australia will be UniSuper. You want to understand what's going on there and what's good for you. And it's not always easy to understand what are you going to be doing 20 or 30 years down the track. But having some money to enjoy retirement, I think, is quite important. And of course, all of us want to forget COVID-19, but this is also a talk about biomedical science. And I think COVID-19 will keep us busy for quite some time to come, especially in the field of genomics, both of the viral genomes, but certainly also in susceptibility in humans, long COVIDs, what's the predisposition to that. And I should tell you, for example, I'm also one of the guest editors at Human Genomics, which is a journal with an impact factor of about 6.5 for COVID-19, with another friend of mine, Giuseppe Novelli at Italy. And so let me sort of throw out some advice and maybe also stimulate discussion. And one of the things that I want to do as we go along here is to get as many questions as possible and to sort of try and answer them. But I'm going to try and stimulate some discussion right away. So I think the first thing is you want to go to the best places possible and work with the best people possible. And that means both as advisors, but also for you when you have your own lab the students. You want to have the best students possible. You want to pick great mentors. And I'm extremely grateful to my PhD mentor, Paul Berg, who really had a lasting impact on my career. What I didn't tell you, or what I mentioned briefly, is I did my biochemistry master's degree in Switzerland. And I talked to the guy there whether I could stay with him for a PhD. And he said, yes, I'd love to have you as a PhD student. But if you're smart, you're going to go to the US. And he helped arrange for me to go to the US to do some experiments there. And that then led to a variety of offers for graduate positions in the US. And as you know, I eventually decided to go to Stanford. I was also fortunate, so I had a good postdoctoral mentor who really allowed me to do what I wanted to do, and that was great. But then the other big mentors for me were when I was an assistant professor, non-tenured. I was very fortunate that I hooked up with some epidemiologists, and they also changed my career. We did some very important stuff together on cancer, which was very interesting, led to enormous amounts of funding. At some point, I had 19 people in my lab and an annual budget of $1 million US, and so that was 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And it was mostly because we did molecular epidemiology, which was really starting at the time. We're among the people who started it. And I remember that some of my biochemistry colleagues advised me that I shouldn't be working with pencil pushers, that it was going to ruin my career. But these people changed my career. In the end, I did get tenure. I was promoted. Nobody questions when you have a lot of money because it's peer reviewed. And so I have been fortunate to have great mentors from my undergraduate studies in Switzerland, through my PhD studies, through my postdoc, and even as a young assistant professor, I had great mentors, and they had important advice for me throughout my career, and I'm enormously grateful to all of them. You want to seek out challenges and new experiences, both in the lab and also in your life. Mentoring is intensely personal. I recounted to you how when I wanted to start at Stanford in Paul Berg's lab, that the only graduate student who was there said, don't do it. He is a ... It worked out great for me. The other student who started with me should have listened. So it's intensely personal. And Paul and I remained in touch until a year or two before his death. And, you know, we always had a great relationship. Work-life balance is important. Science and research require a great deal of dedication, but you do want to remember your work-life balance. As I mentioned, you want to work with the best students possible. And if you're running your own lab, you're going to have to decide how you want to run your lab, whether that is through mostly through postdocs, mostly through graduate students. I tried both, and I always had both in my lab. I must say that I always felt the strongest connection to my graduate students. But other people run their labs mostly on postdocs. That was the case for me when I was at Baylor with my mentor there. And also Paul Berg had mostly postdocs and very few graduate students. It is important that one acknowledges the accomplishments of the people that work with you, whether it's your students or your postdocs. It's their careers that you're trying to foster. So make sure you take pride in and acknowledge take pride in their accomplishments, that you acknowledge them, that they help you, and that you help them along in their careers. Seek advice from mentors and senior colleagues on everything that you do, especially as a young faculty member. So whether that's grants, grant proposals, it's much better if one of your colleagues tells you that there's something wrong with your grants proposal than when the study section tells you that it's crap. You want to seek out great collaborators. I think it's very important that you get along with them. That makes life a lot easier if you like who you are working with. Obviously, as you're progressing through your career, you want to write as many papers as possible and the best journals possible. And early in your career, you want to be mostly first author. As you move along and become more senior, you might want to opt for more last positions or towards the end of the author list, and let your students and postdocs be first authors. Money is what makes the world go round, so you need to apply for and you need to get grants. It is incredibly important. It's peer-reviewed. It's a validation of your research that will be incredibly important if you go up for promotions. I can speak for my own experience that working in an emerging or developing countries can be very rewarding. YachayTech in Ecuador was a very interesting experience for me, and I'm still in touch with many people who try to work on that project in Ecuador. And you want to be a good citizen. By a good citizen, I mean, remember that there are three pillars of the university: research, teaching, and service. So service and engagement is very important, whether that is at your own institution, serving on committees, whether that is beyond your institution. So I talked about some of the committees I serve on internationally, serving on editorial boards of journals. That's all important, and it's part of the service to the scientific community. Of course, all of us are also citizens who, especially if you're at public universities, but also if you have grants at private universities, you're spending public money. So that means you should engage with the public when warranted on research in general and science in general. And you want to be yourself. Part of doing science and research is a way of expressing yourself. So I'm going to delve now into a few things along the career. If I look at the list of people, is there anybody here who absolutely needs to hear something about how to get into graduate school and how to make decisions in graduate school? Speak up now, put it into the chats, or we're going to move on to the next step, which might be interested to a few people. Anybody who wants grad school? Going once, going twice, gone. So once you're in graduate school, at some point you need to think about what you're going to do. And so since I've told you a few things about Paul Berg, when I thought I should graduate, I actually went into Paul's office and told him, look, Paul, I think I'm ready to graduate. And so I then had to listen for about 30 minutes to a lecture from Paul Berg about what one should do as a graduate student. And when he had delivered that lecture, he concluded by saying, you've done all of that. Now, what can we do to keep you here? And so that, of course, was a tempting offer to stay at Stanford. I decided that I wanted to learn something new. So I wanted to do human genetics. So I was in the Department of Biochemistry as a graduate student, and I wanted to learn stuff about human genetics and human genomics. And so Paul immediately agreed that that was a good idea for me, and pulled out some journals and said, you should talk to these people. And of course, all of them were happy to talk to me. And so I wound up, and that's how I wound up at Baylor. I think I had 2 or 3 offers to do postdocs, and I chose one of them and went to do my postdoc at Baylor. So once you start your postdoc, you want to identify a suitable postdoctoral project. And really what you want to do is you want to set yourself up for success as an independent scientist in your own right. So make sure you get a suitable postdoctoral project that is doable in a few years' time, that will yield publications, but will also allow you to do your work on your own. It might be worthwhile to get some teaching experience. It's probably in the US not as important as it's in many other parts of the world, like Europe, Latin America, Australia, where teaching is one of the requirements for people in academic positions. So I can tell you that I at some point got kicked upstairs as a postdoc in my last year, and so I did do some teaching. You clearly want to write as many papers as possible so that you're well known in your research field. You want to create your own network, especially at scientific meetings, by presenting, but also by networking with people at like social functions at the meeting, at posters, and so on. Quite importantly, you want to apply for grants and take them with you if at all possible. So I mentioned that Baylor, my mentor there, at some point gave me a nominally independent position, although I was still a postdoc in his lab. And I wound up with a Starter Scholar Award in the US, which I could take with me. And so that allowed me to find several jobs once I applied for jobs, because if you got your own funding, most people are going to be interested in hiring you. So once you have your first academic job, you need to understand what your contractual obligations are. So for example, when I started in the US, my contract said that there is an expectation that I bring in 50% of my salary on grants. So you need to understand what the contract actually expects from you. It might be teaching. So I was expected to do 5 hours of medical school teaching, and that's 5 hours a year. So clearly teaching wasn't one of the main things I was hired for. I did more than that. I created my own graduate class and so on. So, but that's what you want to do. I think it's good to have a suitable mentor or mentors. As I mentioned, I was in biochemistry, but I hooked up with some epidemiologists in preventive medicine, and that changed my career. It was a wonderful experience. They were all senior people, but somehow they took a liking to me, and we liked each other. We worked well together. It was a great experience. It changed my career. Clearly, you need to set up your lab, and that will take some time. You need to make sure that you have a decent startup package to do that. Again, you need to apply for and get grants. You want to collaborate internally, externally. Once again, you want to network by attending meetings, presenting, hanging out at social functions, and make sure people know you. Publish in the best journals. Engage wisely in committee and other service, because service is important, but it can also kill a lot of time. So you need to be judicious. Teach and enjoy the interactions, especially if you're in academia. You should not be an academic. You should not be at an academic institution unless you enjoy working with young people. And so I've always enjoyed working with students, and I've also had postdocs. Of course, some people enjoy working with postdocs, but that's what you want to do. At some point, you want to explore your promotion to the next level. An American system that will be associate professor, so in Australia. And that means that you need to prepare a dossier. You want to talk to your department chair about it and how to go about that. So once you're associate professor or senior lecturer, again, you want to take stock. You want to plan for the next stage of your life and career. And never forget, there is also a life that you want to live. You want to plan for sustained effort in all three pillars: research, teaching, and service. You want to write the best possible grants and papers. You want to network. You want to build a stable and successful lab. And again, at some point, you want to start thinking about the promotion. And as a full professor, you want to enjoy your promotion. You've made it. You're a full professor. You want to work on all three pillars: research, teaching, and service. I did one sabbatical. And one of the things I learned is I should have done it sooner. I should have done it more often. Sabbaticals are a great way to rejuvenate your research, start a new project. So I, for example, started working on a completely new area, made new friends, and I thought it was a very worthwhile experience. And one of the things I learned, I should have done it sooner, and I should have done it more often. If you have the opportunity, try and get an endowed chair, which gives you some stability. If you are so inclined, explore senior administration and leadership. So, for example, at some point, I decided I was going to give back to a system that had been very good to me. So I became a dean and eventually a vice chancellor or the equivalent of a vice rector, prorector, or vice presidents of the university. And believe it or not, you want to think about an enjoyable retirement. And so I do want to mention some of the people who have been important in my career. So I talked about mentors. Jeff Schatz was the person in Switzerland who said, you can stay in my lab, I'd love to have you, but if you're smart, you're going to go to the US. I was fortunate enough to work in Paul Berg's lab and did my postdoc with Savio Wu. I had some important collaborators as who are epidemiologists or were epidemiologists who changed my career. We had a wonderful interaction and it got us tons of money. I also had great collaborators at Sydney. I mentioned I had probably 30, 40, if not 50 students, but two of the best ones were Mick Makrodakis, who is now the Associate Director for Research in Rare Diseases at one of the pharma companies, and Florence Chung, and that's in the US. And Florence Chung, who is actually working on COVID for the New South Wales government. And so I should mention that Australia, like the US, is a federation, so much of the health stuff is done by the states. So Florence, who was with me at the University of Sydney, is in New South Wales. Mick never really left, he sort of kept hanging around. And I also have some ongoing collaborations. And last but not least, I mentioned Paul Berg to you. This was a few years ago before COVID. He died earlier this year in his mid-90s. He won a Nobel Prize. He had a fantastic career as a scientist, but he was a great mentor to me. And I'm extremely grateful for what he's done for my career. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Juergen, thank you very much. I think you set the pace for those that are interested in pursuing such a career. Occasionally quite difficult, stressful, with the ups and downs several times. And yeah, but I think in the end, it's something to keep in mind that it's rewarding. Any questions?
Yeah, so before people ask their questions, so I would echo what George said. People have often asked me whether I would have done things differently. And so, as George mentioned, academic careers can be extremely rewarding. So I've always enjoyed working with my students. Yes, there are ups and downs, but I wouldn't have done anything different. And the reason why I got into administration or senior leadership, whatever you want to call it, at some point was that I wanted to give back to a system that had been very good to me. And I wanted to help and make it better for younger people. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Who goes first? Well, let me ask basically your experience from, because you've been to well-established universities and all of a sudden you have been asked and you have decided basically to join YachayTech. YachayTech was the first technical university, private, if I recall correctly, in Ecuador, in Quito. No, okay. But the ambition was to become the MIT of Ecuador. That was one hell of a challenge. So if you can just share with us some of your experience with your tenure in this environment.
So, I mean, it was clearly a very important experience in my career. And so I should tell you, I speak Spanish. And so I'm a gringo who speaks Spanish, which meant that I was regularly on TV already in the US because there are Spanish language TV stations. And of course, I was on TV or in the press in Ecuador. And part of the reason for that is it is a public university, but it was the brainchild of the president of Ecuador at the time, who wanted to create the equivalent of Caltech, not quite MIT, but Caltech. in Ecuador and for Latin America. And part of the idea was to create a knowledge economy. I should tell you that Ecuador is an OPEC country, so it exports petroleum, raw petroleum. And of course, it has an agricultural sector, but in terms of, and there is mining. But so in terms of industry, there is very little. So part of the idea was to create a technical university that would create the workforce and the knowledge for Ecuador to become a developed country. That went pear-shaped at some points because the president was no longer president. Other people came into power who didn't want that. I would tell you that drugs and drug trafficking became a huge issue. I don't know how many of you actually follow what happens in Ecuador, but there are huge problems now, mostly related to serious criminality, dealing with that stem from drug trafficking. The university still exists, but most of the people that I started with, and certainly all of the senior leadership is gone. There are new people in place, but the ambition of creating the Caltech of Ecuador or Latin America is no more. And and when I was there, YachayTech ranked routinely among the top 3 in Ecuador in terms of publications. Now it's sitting somewhere in the middle. So there's was a question about European grants. So EU grants are notorious for how bureaucratic they are. So I can only sympathize with that, and I see already George grinning. I think it's very important to have networks to write grants. The EU, for better or for worse, and I don't know how that plays out with the US, where ESA is, but they clearly also collaborate with other parts of the world. So we actually had some EU money in Ecuador, believe it or not, and the EU actually had the equivalent of an ambassador sitting in Quito. Australia also sometimes does stuff with the EU and ENBO in particular. But so it depends on where you are. I think if you're in the US, you probably have a disadvantage that people think everyone is rolling in money in the US. So there might be some hesitation sending more money to the US. But I think networks are important, and the funding mechanisms are, in the end, what makes it happen. But I think you have to be flexible in terms of what kind of funding mechanisms to go for. It's not just the EU. There is the Wellcome Trust and the UK. There's the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. There are a variety of ways you can try and get international grants going. And the NIH, of course, also does that. So somebody.
And if I may say here to the question from Isa, basically, in Holland, I spent 11 years as a paid researcher in Erasmus MC, and I still have an adjunct appointment there. So knowing the situation, the MVO has amazing grant schemes. One way to continue your collaboration would be perhaps to have an adjunct faculty position in the university that you were in the Netherlands, and then use this as a stepping stone to pursue funding from Dutch universities. So it's not that you will receive US funding for have such a collaborations, but you'll have dedicated funding in that university as well. My only question is whether your university would allow that if Mayo Clinic,
Yeah, that's the problem. And they won't allow me to share data, of course. So unless I get some kind of budget, coming from the, so I've been wondering about continuing my collaboration with my European colleagues because of this. You know, how much time should I spend on working on these grant proposals when I can be on the group, you know, as one of the PIs, for example. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess the other thing is picking up also on what George said. I think having an adjunct appointment in Europe somewhere, so whether that's in the Netherlands or somewhere else, may not be a bad idea. Mayo, of course, is primarily a clinic, right? So I guess I'm going to try and be careful on how I'm going to phrase this, but the culture of the three pillars of research, teaching, and service may be somewhat skewed towards one rather than the others. But my guess is, and I'm always an optimist, where there is a will, there is a way. And you had alluded to the fact that Mayo wants to see some money. I can tell you nothing persuades people more than money. So once you bring in money, people go, yes, it's a good idea. You should do that. So in some ways is whether the chicken comes before the egg or which one that goes. But if you can show Mayo, here's the money, I'm going to do this now, I don't think they will stop you.
Okay. Thank you.
There's a question from Maria.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Juergen, for this talk. I'm starting like now my PhD, so I'm starting my career, let's say, and I wanted to ask you if since you started your postdoc, did you know that you would like to have this academic career, or you also, so it was like something that it was a continuously movement, like your postdoc, then you did your teaching, or you thought that of other options? Because now I don't know what I will do, you know, I don't know. And I wanted to know if you already knew that that was what you wanted, or it was just life, you know, giving you the path.
Very nice question.
Yes, so it reminds me of what my postdoctoral mentor, Samuel Wu, used to say, and that is that academics are late bloomers. So I was sort of meandering around and I fell into one thing after another. I will admit that in high school, I was not a very good student. But in order to study biology in Germany, you have to have a certain average. And I remember one of the teachers asking what grade you need in Latin. I had 9 years of Latin, believe it or not, in order for you to make it into biology, because you will do great things. So this is a high school teacher. And he gave me that grade. He said I should have failed you, but he gave me that grade. And so I studied biology because one of my high school teachers helped me to get in there, and I knew I wanted to do that. And once so I decided to move from Germany to Switzerland for a variety of reasons that had nothing to do with study. But in Switzerland, I decided that I enjoyed doing research and that I wanted to do a PhD. I talked to my mentor there. He said, you can stay with me. I'd love to have you, but if you're smart, you're going to go to the US. And so when I agreed to that, he arranged for me to spend a year in the US. I published 2 JDC papers from that 1 year at Cornell. I decided that the winters in upstate New York weren't what I enjoyed. So I could have stayed with this guy at Cornell, but the winters weren't what I liked. And I was accepted at Berkeley in Northern California. And I interviewed at Stanford. So I called up Stanford and said, hey guys, what's the story on Stanford? And 2 hours later, I was admitted there. So I sort of fell into that again. At Stanford, I decided, so I was in biochemistry. I decided that I wanted to learn human genetics. And so I guess I could have stayed with Paul at Stanford, but he arranged for me to interview with 3 people at Baylor for my postdoc, and 2 of them offered me a position. So I decided that Samuel Wu was the guy I wanted to work with. So I can't say that I had a grand plan. I sort of muddled along, and it worked out. And again, I'm reminded of what Savio said. Academics often, including myself, are late bloomers. I sort of had an idea about what I wanted to do, but things just somehow worked out. Someone else raised the
Yep.
Hello. Yeah, I think Dr. Horker is raising his hand. George.
Yes. I would like to ask question. What are the prospects in India on the basis of collaboration and other fields, sponsorship and other fields? Because in India it is very difficult to come to the international grounds. Is there any institution or the branch where we can consult them? Some of the NGOs are also there who are working in the field of the genetics, genomes, etc. How it is possible for Indian continent?
I'm not an expert on India. I've been to India a few times, but I'm not an expert on grants in India. But one of the things I certainly see, since we're talking about genomics here, that pan genomes are probably a big thing for the foreseeable future. And India is a country of 1.5 billion, or with a variety of different populations. So yes. I'm speculating here, but there are probably lots of different pan-genomes in India, and there are a variety of funding agencies who are going to be interested in that, both in Europe and the US. I'm sure there's someone in India and Singapore, Australia, for that matter. So I think trying to set up collaborations on specific areas where India can uniquely contribute is probably something that we need to do.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
My pleasure. Isa is back.
Yeah, I'm on the Global Genomic Medicine Consortium for Family Health History and Pharmacogenomics, and we frequently work internationally with other countries, such as Thailand, such as Africa. It's Egypt. So I do see and feel, what India must be feeling, but G2MC is definitely interested in working with India. So please reach out to us.
Okay.
If I may say here, the interest, from what I see, Dr. Hawker shows that original interest.
Yes.
And I really suspect that he will certainly reach out. I should just mention that the interest, we will try as G2MC to be also genuine from our part and provide all the motivation you need to sustain your motivation and not just be some type of a firework that will extinguish over time.
Thank you.
But I am looking forward to more World Health Organization grants, where you are increasingly engaged to work together globally, and especially in the genetics field where we need more diversity in research. It will be very beneficial to have some kind of grants that would enable us to do so. So, yeah.
So if I may add, we are planning on asking our members for their ideas so we can get some ideas of what they'd like to do in country, how they would like to collaborate, and provide that as provide a venue for sharing those concepts and ideas to foster that type of collaboration, and also looking for grant opportunities that are within country that can contribute to that broader collaboration and cobble the funding together. So we'd like to really facilitate that. And Dr. Holkar, we would welcome you to any of our working groups and participate and provide your ideas. And the opportunities that you see in India, but how would you like to collaborate your ideas with other organizations and other countries?
Thank you.
And I had one question as a follow-up, Juergen, to getting grants, because you received quite a few grants over the years. How did you start the ideas for those grants? Because you can apply, you can get rejected multiple times, 1 in 10. And how do you keep the motivation going? How do you find your background data in order to create those grants and then get the collaboration going with somebody who can help you, someone who could leverage your experience, who has a name?
Yeah, so obviously grants are, so thank you for the question, Pidgey. So grants are obviously the lifeblood of research. And because they're peer reviewed, they also carry a certain cachet in addition to the money. So I'm going to say something that many people may find strange, but I've always enjoyed writing grants. I'm still involved in doing that, not as a PI myself anymore, but with other people, because I really enjoyed generating novel ideas and thinking about what that research could be, how it could be interesting, how it could be exciting, what new discoveries you might want to come up with. I will, of course, qualify this by saying, as Toby already mentioned, I did not enjoy getting rejected. And so you got to keep going. If something gets rejected 20 times, there's probably something wrong with it, and you shouldn't keep reapplying. But creating novel ideas, talking to people about what the ideas are. And as Tiji also mentioned, once you have the ideas of what the proposal should be about, once you have the specific themes on what you want to do, you want to make sure that you have exciting, often unpublished preliminary data that makes that proposal exciting in the sense that when a reviewer reads it, that they really get engaged and say, wow, this is great data. It really supports the hypothesis. I want to fund this. Because again, as Teju mentioned, in many places, the funding line now is 10, 12%. So that means of 10 grant applications, 1 gets funded. And so if you're average, you need to put in 10 applications to get 1 funded. And I cannot tell you how many applications I put in. It must have been in the hundreds. So you need to have a thick skin, just like with your papers. If they get rejected, if it's a good paper, someone will pick it up. But you also got to be smart. If your grants keep getting rejected, you may have to rethink that. I found it incredibly important to have collaborators of whom I could bounce off ideas. Especially when I was younger, I really appreciated people telling me if something wasn't a great idea, that I'd rather hear it from them than from the study section. So I benefited enormously from, especially when I was younger, to have people who would tell me, not the greatest way to go about it or not the greatest idea. And you got to keep your ego in check. If someone who's much more senior than you are, you should think about it. I mentioned that I switched from straight molecular biology and human genetics to molecular epidemiology when I was a young assistant professor. And I had 2 biochemistry faculty who were much senior to me come and talk to me separately, telling me that I was screwing up my career, that I was working with pencil pushers, that this was not science. Once the money started rolling in, nobody said a thing. So you also got to decide at some point, this is something I want to do. I believe in myself and my colleagues, and I'm going to do this. But you're taking a risk. I mean, the risk I was taking is that I wasn't going to get promoted, that I wasn't going to get tenure, and I would be kicked out of the university. It worked out. You have to decide what's best for your career. It worked out for me. But yes, getting grant funding is highly competitive. You've got to have a decent strategy going about it. For me, it was to have a great network of people who would tell me what were good ideas, what were bad ideas, I've always enjoyed, to this day, creating new proposals, creating new ideas. I love writing down the specific aims. I love developing the strategies or the hypotheses behind it. Why is this important? And if I don't get excited about it, you better believe that the study section and the referees looking at your proposal will not be excited. So you got to feel a sense of excitement.
Any other questions?
So you guys can also email me if you want to
Yeah.
shoot me or so once we're done here.
Great. So yeah, Latifa, please go ahead.
No, I just made thank you, first of all, Dr. Juergen, for this insightful presentation, and George for moderating this session. So I put in the chat box the upcoming webinar series that's going to take place on September 28th at 11 a.m. EST, 3 p.m. UTC time. Please save the dates, and you have the information on the chat box, but I will provide more information when I got the bios from the speakers and so forth. So stay tuned for these exciting events. And thank you everyone for your participation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Juergen,
It was
thank you so much.
nice talk. Yeah.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Cheers.